We begin, as we always do, with a name that history nearly forgot, and a windmill that nearly fell before anyone remembered to save it. In the autumn of 1887, in a dust-worn corner of the Kansas plains, a man named Ezra Whitlock stood at the edge of a bank auction with $9.40 in his coat pocket. The entire remainder of a life that had once included a wife, a farmhouse, and 400 acres of wheat. The auctioneer that day was selling off what nobody else wanted: broken plows, a lame mule, and a rickety, half-collapsed windmill that had stood abandoned on the old Pruitt land for 11 years, its blades frozen mid-turn like a clock that had stopped counting time it no longer believed in. The townsfolk laughed when Ezra raised his hand. "Nobody wants that old windmill," a farmer named Hollis Pratt called out from the crowd, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You'd be better off buying the dirt it's standing in." But Ezra bought it anyway, for $4, because $4 was what he had left after the mule, and because something about the way the late sun caught its rusted veins made him feel, for reasons he could not have explained to a living soul, that it was waiting for him. He did not know yet that sealed within its rafters was a secret that had waited 23 years to be found, one that would not only restore everything Ezra had lost, but would return to an entire town something it did not even know it was missing. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ezra Whitlock. If this story moves you, we'd be grateful if you'd stay through to the end, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Ezra Whitlock had been raised, some 31 years before that auction day, on a modest homestead outside a settlement called Millbrook Hollow, a town so small it existed mostly as a rumor to travelers passing through on the rail line to Dodge City. His father, Amos Whitlock, had been a wheelwright and part-time carpenter, a broad, quiet man whose hands seemed permanently stained with linseed oil, and whose single unbending rule in life was that a thing built poorly was a thing built dishonestly. Ezra's mother, Ruth, had died of a fever when he was 9, and it was Amos alone who raised him after that, teaching the boy not through lectures, but through long afternoons spent side by side in the workshop, where the boy learned to read the grain of a plank of oak the way other children learned their letters. Wood remembers, Amos used to tell him, running a thumb along a fresh-cut beam. It remembers the storm that bent it, and the season that grew it slow and hard. You listen to a piece of wood before you cut it, and it will tell you what it wants to become. It was a strange kind of wisdom for a boy to carry into manhood, but Ezra carried it faithfully, and it would serve him, decades later, in ways his father could never have imagined. Ezra grew into a steady young man, unremarkable in the ways that mattered to gossiping neighbors, not the tallest, not the loudest, not the wealthiest, but possessed of a patience that older folks in Millbrook Hollow came to respect, the kind of patience that let him mend a fence twice before it was right rather than once before it was convenient. At 22, he married a schoolteacher named Constance Ayers, a woman with a laugh like a struck bell and a habit of pressing wildflowers between the pages of her books, and together they took up a modest parcel of land on the northern edge of the county, where they built, board by careful board, the kind of life that people in that era called simple and meant as the highest compliment they knew how to give. They were not wealthy. They were, for a handful of years, something better, sufficient. Constance kept a garden that fed half the widows on their road when the need arose, and Ezra, true to his father's teaching, became the man neighbors called upon when a wagon axle split or a barn roof sagged, always refusing more payment than the job was worth, always leaving a house sturdier than he found it. It was, in the plainest words we can offer, a good life, built on the unglamorous virtues of showing up, doing right, and expecting little credit for either. It was during those years that Ezra first came to know the windmill on the old Pruitt land, though he did not know then what history it held. The Pruitt windmill, as it was called locally, had been raised in the early 1860s by a settler named Thaddeus Pruitt, one of the original families to stake a claim in that stretch of the territory, and for a time it had been the only working grist mill for 11 miles in any direction, grinding grain not just for the Pruitts, but for every homesteading family scattered across that lonesome country. Farmers would load their wagons before dawn and travel for hours just to stand in line at its base, trading gossip and seed corn while they waited their turn, and in this way the windmill had become, without anyone quite declaring it so, the true center of the community, more central, in its way, than the church or the dry goods store, because it was the place where survival itself was measured out, sack by sack. Ezra remembered, as a boy, being lifted onto his father's shoulders to watch the great wooden blades turn against a sky the color of a ripe peach. And he remembered old Thaddeus Pruitt himself, a spare, silver-bearded man who always kept a peppermint drop in his coat pocket for children who waited patiently. It was, in Ezra's boyhood memory, a place of abundance and welcome. He had no reason, then, to suspect it would one day become something else entirely, a monument to a wrong nobody in Millbrook Hollow had ever properly reckoned with. The fall came for Ezra slowly, the way it so often does, disguised at first as ordinary misfortune. It began with 2 years of drought so severe that the creek beds cracked into maps of countries that did not exist, and the wheat that had once stood shoulder high came up thin and yellow, barely worth the cutting. Ezra and Constance tightened what little they had to tighten, sold the second mule, patched clothes instead of replacing them, and told each other, in the manner of people determined to believe it, that the rains would return. They did return, eventually, but by then a debt had accumulated at the Millbrook County Bank that the harvest alone could not erase, and the man who held that debt, a banker named Josiah Renner, newly arrived from the east with polished boots and a smile that never once reached his eyes, was not a man inclined toward patience. Renner had built his brief but formidable reputation in the county on a simple, ruthless method. He extended credit generously to struggling families in lean years, then called the notes due the very season fortune seemed poised to turn, seizing land at auction prices before the debtor could recover enough to repay him honestly. Ezra did not understand this pattern until it was too late to matter, until the letter arrived demanding immediate and full payment, until the Whitlock homestead itself was posted for auction on the courthouse steps. Then came the second blow, crueler than the first, arriving that same terrible winter. A fever swept through the county, the kind that took the very old and the very young with equal indifference, and Constance, who had spent every waning ounce of her strength nursing 3 of the widow families she loved on the road, caught it herself and did not recover. Ezra buried his wife in the frozen ground of a churchyard he could no longer afford to tend, and 3 weeks later he stood on the same courthouse steps and watched Josiah Renner's clerk read aloud the notice that the Whitlock land, house, and remaining livestock would be sold to satisfy the outstanding debt. Neighbors who had once traded flour and gossip with Ezra now averted their eyes, not out of cruelty, but out of the particular shame that poverty inflicts on witnesses as much as on victims. And within the space of one gray season, the man who had inherited his father's steady hands and his father's respected name found himself with nothing, no wife, no home, no land, and $9.40 folded into a coat pocket that had once held far more, back when far more had seemed permanent. It was in this reduced and grieving state that Ezra wandered, weeks later, toward an auction he had heard would be liquidating the last remnants of the old Pruitt estate. Thaddeus Pruitt himself having died childless and heirless some years before, his land absorbed piecemeal into other holdings, his windmill left standing derelict because no one considered it worth the cost of dismantling. Ezra had not gone to that auction intending to buy anything. He had gone, if he was honest with himself, because he had nowhere else in particular to be, and because there remained in him some stubborn, unexamined thread connecting him to the memory of that windmill's turning blades and Thaddeus Pruitt's peppermint drops. When Hollis Pratt laughed and declared that nobody wanted the old windmill, something in Ezra, perhaps grief looking for a shape to attach itself to, perhaps his father's old teaching that a poorly regarded thing might still remember what it once was, made him raise his hand and offer his $4. The auctioneer, more amused than skeptical, accepted the bid without argument, glad to be rid of a structure that occupied land someone might eventually wish to plow. And so Ezra Whitlock, a man with $5.40 remaining to his name, became the owner of a windmill that 11 years of wind and neglect had reduced to a leaning skeleton of gray, weathered wood. He walked out to the Pruitt land the following morning, past fields gone to seed and a farmhouse whose windows stared back at him like empty sockets, until he reached the windmill itself, standing at the crest of a low rise the way it always had, its blades, 4 of the original 8 remaining, hanging motionless and cracked, its tower listing very slightly, like an old man favoring a bad hip. Up close, the damage was worse than memory had allowed him to expect. The ladder rungs bolted to its side were rusted through in places. The lower boards had rotted at the base where rain had pooled for over a decade, and a family of barn swallows had built and abandoned 3 generations of nests in the eaves. And yet, as Ezra circled the structure slowly, running his palm along its weathered grain exactly as his father had taught him, he felt none of the foolishness that Hollis Pratt's laughter had tried to plant in him. He felt, instead, that the wood remembered something, and that it was waiting for someone patient enough to ask what. He began the repairs that same week. Though repair was almost too generous a word for the labor involved, it was closer to resurrection. He replaced the rotted baseboards first, salvaging what sound lumber he could and supplementing it with wood he cut, and cured himself from a stand of trees along the dry creek, working from dawn until the light failed him, sleeping in a lean-to he constructed from the windmill's own discarded planks. Word traveled, as it does in small towns, that the widower Whitlock had lost his mind and bought Pruitt's ruin of a windmill, and though most of Millbrook Hollow regarded this as further evidence of a man broken by grief, a few, an old widow named Bertha Kessler who brought him bread some evenings, a boy named Samuel who liked to watch him work, began to visit, first out of curiosity and then, slowly, out of something like hope. Because a windmill rising again from ruin is a difficult thing for even the most cynical heart to witness without feeling some flicker of possibility stir back to life. It was during the 3rd week of this labor, while Ezra was reinforcing the cap of the windmill where the great central shaft met the rafters supporting the blades, that he first noticed the irregularity. The rafters in that section were built oddly, thicker than the structural load required, boxed in with an extra course of planking that served, as far as he could determine through an afternoon of careful inspection, no mechanical purpose whatsoever. His father's old instinct rose in him immediately. A builder does not add unnecessary wood, unnecessary weight, unnecessary cost, unless he is hiding something the eye is not meant to find. Ezra worked at the seam of that boxed rafter with the patience of a man who had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. And as the late afternoon sun slanted gold through the tower's high slats, he pried loose a panel that had not been touched, he would later estimate, in over 2 decades, and found himself looking into a narrow, dust-thick cavity built into the very bones of the windmill, a hidden room no larger than a modest closet, tucked into the rafters where no casual observer, and certainly no auctioneer eager to be rid of derelict property, would ever have thought to look. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that had kept the worst of the weather and the vermin at bay, Ezra found a small iron strongbox, a leather satchel gone stiff with age, and a stack of ledgers whose spines had cracked but whose pages, remarkably, had survived. His hands trembled as he lifted the strongbox down through the narrow opening, not from any hope of treasure, but from the simple, overwhelming recognition that he was touching something another man had gone to enormous trouble to conceal, and that concealment of that magnitude was never undertaken for trivial reasons. The strongbox was locked, its key long since lost to time, and it took him the better part of an hour with a chisel and considerable care not to damage whatever lay within before the hinges finally gave. Inside, he found not gold, as a hungrier man might have hoped, but something that would prove, in time, to be worth a great deal more, a set of handwritten ledgers documenting, in Thaddeus Pruitt's own careful hand, the grain accounts of every family who had ever brought wheat to his mill, alongside a bundle of letters tied with twine gone brittle as old bone, and a single folded document bearing the county seal, a deed. The deeper mystery revealed itself to Ezra slowly, over the course of several sleepless nights spent by lantern light, poring over Thaddeus Pruitt's careful, aging handwriting. The ledgers told a story that no one currently living in Millbrook Hollow fully remembered, though older residents like Bertha Kessler recalled fragments of it the way one recalls a dream upon waking. That in the years before the war, Thaddeus Pruitt had not merely operated the windmill for private profit, but had structured it, quietly and deliberately, as something closer to a communal trust. Families too poor to pay for grinding in coin were permitted to pay in labor or in kind, their debts recorded faithfully but never called due with cruelty. When a widow's crop failed, Pruitt simply crossed her balance from the ledger and wrote, in the margin, "The Lord provides, and so must we." More than that, the letters revealed that Pruitt had, over the course of nearly a decade, set aside a portion of every transaction's proceeds into a fund intended for a singular purpose: the establishment of a communal grain cooperative that would guarantee every family in the county fair prices and protection against exactly the kind of predatory lending that had, generations later, cost Ezra his own homestead. Pruitt had called it, in one letter to a cousin back east, his Windmill covenant, a promise that the mill would never be allowed to become an instrument of any one man's greed against his neighbors. But the deed was what stopped Ezra's breath entirely. It was a land grant, drawn up and formally filed in the year 1864, transferring a substantial parcel of the surrounding acreage, land that Ezra now understood, with mounting astonishment, bordered directly on the very homestead the Whitlock family had once owned and recently lost, into a trust to be held in perpetuity for the benefit of Millbrook Hollow's homesteading families, administered jointly by the Pruitt family and, strikingly, by whichever family thereafter came to occupy and maintain the windmill itself, so long as they honored the covenant's original terms. Thaddeus Pruitt, it seemed, had anticipated a day when he himself might not live to see the covenant fulfilled, and had built into the trust a mechanism by which stewardship, and the obligations that came with it, would pass forward to whoever proved willing to care for the mill when others had abandoned it. He had hidden the deed and the ledgers. The letters made clear, after a bitter dispute with a distant relative who had tried to have him declared incompetent in order to seize the land outright and sell it for private gain, a dispute that had frightened the old man enough to conceal the documents rather than risk their destruction, intending to reveal them once the danger passed. But Thaddeus Pruitt had died of a sudden apoplexy before he ever had the chance, and the secret had slept in the rafters for 23 years, waiting, as Ezra now understood it, for exactly the kind of patient, unglamorous hands that had once fixed fences twice to make sure they were done right. The trouble began, as trouble in small towns so often does, the moment word slipped out that Ezra Whitlock had found something in that old windmill worth more than idle curiosity. It was Samuel, the boy who liked to watch him work, who innocently mentioned at the dry goods store that Mr. Whitlock had found old papers and a deed among the rafters, and by the following Sunday the story had traveled, twisted and inflated by each retelling, until half of Millbrook Hollow believed Ezra had unearthed a fortune in gold. Among those who heard the rumor with particular and calculating interest was Josiah Renner, the very banker whose foreclosure had cost Ezra his home, and who understood, with a lawyer's cold clarity once he obtained a look at the county's original land records, exactly what a legitimate 1864 trust deed covering that acreage would mean for the mortgages and land titles he had spent years quietly consolidating under his bank's control. If Thaddeus Pruitt's covenant were recognized as valid, several of the very parcels Renner had seized through his aggressive lending practices, including, most gallingly to him, the Whitlock homestead itself, which he had already resold at considerable profit to a cattle speculator from Wichita, would be called into legal question, their titles clouded, their profits threatened, their true history exposed to a county that had never fully understood how many families Renner's methods had quietly ruined. Renner moved swiftly and without shame. He first sent a lawyer to Ezra's makeshift camp at the windmill, offering to purchase the ledgers, letters, and deed outright for a sum that would have made Ezra, on paper, a wealthy man. An offer designed less out of generosity than out of the certainty that Ezra, reduced as he was, could not possibly refuse ready money for old papers of uncertain legal weight. When Ezra declined, quietly but firmly, explaining that the documents belonged not to him personally but, as Pruitt had intended, to the community the covenant was meant to protect, Renner's tactics hardened. He spread word through the county that the papers were likely forgeries, or at best worthless relics of a dead man's eccentricity, unenforceable after so many decades of neglect. He leaned on the county recorder, a man financially indebted to Renner's bank in ways not widely known, to delay any formal review of the deed's validity. And he quietly encouraged Hollis Pratt and a handful of other men who owed Renner money to discourage their neighbors from supporting Ezra's claim, lest the whole tangled question of land titles across the county be thrown, as Renner put it publicly, into needless and costly chaos. For a time, it seemed to work. Doors that had begun to open to Ezra in the weeks since he'd started rebuilding the mill quietly closed again. Old friends grew cautious in their greetings, and Ezra found himself, once more, standing very much alone against a force with money, position, and the easy confidence of a man accustomed to winning. But Ezra had learned patience from a father who taught him to listen to wood before he cut it, and he had learned from Constance, in the years of their marriage, that quiet, steady honesty could outlast almost any storm if a person simply refused to abandon it. Rather than fight Renner in the courthouse, where the banker's influence ran deepest, Ezra did something far simpler and, in its way, far more difficult. He finished rebuilding the windmill, board by board, until its blades once again turned freely in the Kansas wind, and he began grinding grain for anyone who brought it, charging exactly what the original ledgers showed Thaddeus Pruitt had once charged, adjusted honestly for the passing years, and forgiving the debts of families too poor to pay, exactly as the Old Covenant instructed. He read portions of the letters aloud to anyone who would listen, to Bertha Kessler, to Samuel's parents, to the widows on the old road who remembered, once reminded, the peppermint drops and the fair dealing of old Thaddeus Pruitt. And slowly, the true history of the mill began to displace the rumors Renner had planted. It was Bertha Kessler, in the end, who proved decisive, for she recalled that her own late husband had once served as a witness to the original 1864 deed filing, and she still possessed, tucked in a family Bible, a faded receipt bearing the recorder's original seal from that very transaction, proof corroborating Pruitt's hidden documents that predated any of Renner's efforts to discredit them. Armed with Bertha's evidence and the ledger's unbroken chain of record-keeping, Ezra brought the matter before a circuit judge who arrived in the county that spring to hear land disputes, a stern, unhurried man named Judge Corwin who had, as it happened, a personal distaste for banks that grew fat on foreclosed farms. The hearing was not the dramatic courtroom spectacle that later tellings of this story sometimes make it out to be. It was, in truth, a quiet, methodical review of documents spread across a table in the back room of the county courthouse. Renner's lawyers arguing technicalities of filing and lapsed time, Ezra simply and calmly reading aloud, when asked, the plain words of a dead man's covenant. But the documents held. The deed was authentic, properly witnessed, properly filed, its intent unmistakable even after 23 years of dust, and Judge Corwin ruled that the trust Thaddeus Pruitt had established remained valid and binding, its administration passing, exactly as the deed specified, to the current steward of the windmill, to Ezra Whitlock himself, who had rebuilt what others had abandoned and honored. Without knowing it at first, the very covenant he was now legally bound to carry forward. The restoration that followed was not one of sudden riches, but of something Ezra found, in the end, far more valuable. The trust land, freed from the clouded titles Renner had exploited, was surveyed and reallocated according to Pruitt's original intent, and among the parcels restored to their rightful families was, in a turn that struck the entire county as nothing short of providential, the very homestead the Whitlocks had lost, its title voided back through Renner's improper foreclosure and returned, by the trust's own terms, to Ezra's name. Renner himself, exposed before the whole county as a man who had knowingly built his fortune on family's desperation and had tried, when caught, to bury an old man's honest covenant beneath threats and rumor, found his standing collapse with the swiftness such standings often do when the truth of a thing finally becomes plain to the people who trusted him. Depositors withdrew their funds. The county bank's board quietly requested his resignation within the month, and Josiah Renner left Millbrook Hollow before the first snow, his name thereafter spoken, when it was spoken at all, as a cautionary example rather than a mark of respect. No mob gathered against him, no violence was done. The justice that found him was the plainer, more lasting kind. the loss of the trust and regard he had never truly deserved and never worked honestly to keep. Ezra, for his part, did not use his newfound stewardship to enrich himself, though he could have, and though no one in the county would have begrudged him a measure of comfortable relief after everything he had lost. Instead, true to the covenant and true to everything his father's hands had ever taught him about honest building, he used the trust's restored resources to re-establish the grain cooperative exactly as Thaddeus Pruitt had envisioned it decades before, guaranteeing fair prices and forgiving debts for families still recovering from those hard drought years, and using a portion of the mill's proceeds to rebuild a small schoolhouse on the trust land, which he named, with the quiet approval of the whole community, in honor of Constance, who had once pressed wildflowers into the pages of the books she used to teach the county's children. And so the windmill that Hollis Pratt had mocked as worthless, that an entire town had once agreed nobody wanted, rose again on its low rise above Millbrook Hollow, its blades turning steady against the same wide Kansas sky that had watched Ezra as a boy on his father's shoulders and watched him again, years later, as a grieving man with $9.40 and nowhere left to belong. It was never gold that waited in those rafters, though for a time the whole county whispered that it must have been. It was something Thaddeus Pruitt had understood long before anyone else in that hard country seemed to, and something Ezra's own father had tried, in his quiet workshop, to teach a boy who was listening more closely than either of them knew. That value is not always announced by appearances, that a thing weathered and dismissed by careless eyes may still hold, deep in its grain, a promise worth the patience of uncovering, and that the truest inheritance a person can receive is not wealth quietly hoarded but trust quietly kept, and passed forward, plank by careful plank, to whoever proves willing to listen to what the wood remembers. We hope Ezra's story has stayed with you a little tonight, the way the best stories do, long after the words themselves have faded. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you would give this video a like, share it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked things are not always worthless things, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. And before you go, we'd love to know, has there ever been a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every answer, and they mean more to us than you know. Until next time, stay close.